Our government has fixed up our roads. I mean, I drive them all the time. 4-lane everywhere now. I used to follow my boys from Lake Charles up to Monroe to play, was it Neville, the high school there in football? And it's 2-lane road all the way. I mean, 5.5 hours one way to get there. Now, boom, 70 miles an hour. I know it's 65, but I allow a little grace in there. 70 miles an hour all the way. And so, but you got to be careful out there because you got to pay attention on the roads. Sometimes you're not sure who's going to be driving next to you. In fact, I heard one of our troopers had to pull over a car recently on Interstate 20. And he got up beside the car, and it was being driven by an elderly lady, one of her sisters, and she was so small and shriveled up she could barely see over the steering wheel. She kind of slumped down there, and he noticed another elderly lady was sitting in the passenger seat, and she looked kind of strange. Her legs were sticking straight out, her knees were locked, and her hands were reached out forward, and every finger and both thumbs on both hands were stuck into the dashboard, and her mouth was wide open. Her eyes were just like saucers. She was just catatonic, frozen there. So the officer said to the lady, "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over?" She goes, "No, sir, I don't know." He said, "You're driving too slow." He said, "You've been going 20 miles an hour, and that's very dangerous here." And she said, "Well, young man, that's the speed limit. I've been seeing it on these signs here, 20, 20, 20. He said, "No, ma'am, that's not the speed limit sign. That's the name of the highway. This is the Interstate 20. You're going way too slow." He said, "By the way, is something wrong with this lady over here?" And she said, "Oh, that's my sister. Don't mind her. We just turned off 165. The question for us this morning is, what difference does the church make in the world? We can expand on that question by saying, what difference is the church supposed to make in the world? And then perhaps we ought to get more personal, don't you think? What difference does Jerusalem Baptist Church make in the world? And then what difference is Jerusalem Baptist Church supposed to make in the world? In the middle of the last century, a theologian named Richard Niebuhr wrote a book called Christ and Culture, where he endeavored to trace all of the different patterns that the churches had taken in reference to their society, how they tried to influence it and interact with society. He named all of those in his book. That book's still used in our seminaries. I've taken Dr. Niebuhr's work and coalesced all of his different views into 3 approaches that the church has taken with the world. And the first of those approaches I call the church as pro-culture. This means the church is for the culture. Dr. Niebuhr would say Christ is the culture. For you history buffs, you'll remember the time of the Middle Ages during the Holy Roman Empire, where the church and the government were so closely intertwined you couldn't tell where one left off and the other picked up. That would be an example of the church as pro-culture. The second stance that I would call to your attention, I call the church as anti-culture. And of course, that means the church against the culture. During the heyday of the Jesus movement, when I was in college, a lot of young people gathered up and came to Christ, and a lot of different groups formed, and some of them were not orthodox. And one of those unorthodox groups was called the Children of God. And the Children of God taught its young adherents that when they came to faith, they had to abandon every relationship that they'd ever had. They had to turn away from friends and family, and they only could stay together in a commune by themselves. That's an example of the church as anti-culture, the church against the culture. But the third stance that I would point out to you this morning is I call the church as counterculture. Counterculture. This picks up the New Testament idea of being in the world, but not being of the world. It's the church speaking to the culture, teaching the culture, rebuking the culture, cajoling the culture, as Dr. Niebuhr would say, transforming the culture to the things of the kingdom of God. And I submit to you this morning that the appropriate approach that a church ought to take in relationship to its society or to its culture is the church as counterculture.